I am incredulous that I am consenting to this. However, I cannot deny that at the core I am inquisitive. My union with David was not disastrous. From the outside, we appeared to be a stable couple. We did not engage in violent conflict, neither of us deceived. However, the reality was that we had forfeited that fervor. After 12 years of marriage, our lives had become monotonous. We both awoke at the same time, commuted to work, returned home, consumed dinner, watched television, and ultimately drifted off to sleep without fully engaging with each other. The conversations had become monotonous, consisting solely of work, expenses, and weekend plans. There was a time when I would yearn for his touch. However, it no longer felt special when David held me. I was aware that he shared my sentiments. However, we both maintained our silence. Neither of us desired to acknowledge that our affection had diminished. Then Michael, my husband's closest friend and a married man, proposed a daring idea. Have the two of you ever considered the possibility of making a change? A small experiment? Something to rekindle that sentiment that has been forgotten? David laughed, but I observed a contemplative expression in his eyes. Michael's voice was gentle but challenging as he continued. 1 night in 2 days. That concludes the matter. A minor adjustment that could have a significant impact. Who knows? Is it possible that you may rediscover yourself? David caught my eye. And that was the instant I came to the realization that he was genuinely contemplating it. A mere 2 days and 1 night. Just a small experiment. Who knows? Is it possible that you may rediscover yourself? All night, Michael's words reverberated in my mind. I desired to believe that it was merely a playful prank between close companions. However, David's irises did not suggest that he was joking. We refrained from discussing the proposal during our journey home. However, David immediately addressed the audience upon the doors closing. What are your thoughts on the matter? I hesitated. Was he truly contemplating it? Are you being sincere? I inquired, endeavoring to maintain a consistent tone of voice. David shook his head. It is not a detrimental concept. We are still wedded and in love. However, if it has the potential to revitalize our relationship, why not? I desired to dismiss it promptly, to maintain that this was absurd. However, I was also inquisitive in my core. Everything had become so bland and familiar. I pondered at that moment whether it would be worthwhile to undergo a single night of transformation if it could transform everything. I am uncertain as to what prompted my agreement. Maybe it was the desire to experiment with something novel. Perhaps it was the desire to re-establish oneself. Alternatively, it is possible that I was merely engaging in a game of chance, unaware that I was toying with fire. The 4 of us convened at a resort located outside the city that weekend. There was an unusual silence in the air, despite the fact that no one spoke explicitly about it. It was evident when the room keys were transferred. I would be residing with Michael, while David would be residing with Rachel. The moment the door closed behind me, I could feel my heartbeat accelerate quicker than usual. This was incorrect. Guilt ought to have been an appropriate response. Rather, a peculiar current coursed down my spine. Michael seated himself on the settee and poured 2 glasses of wine. Hannah, are you certain that you are in good health? His voice was resonant as he inquired. I nodded. However, I was truly unaware. We initiated conversation. Not regarding the events that were scheduled to transpire tonight, but rather regarding all other matters. Regarding matrimony. Regarding unfulfilled aspirations. Regarding items that we had desired but had neglected. The years. Michael then directed his gaze towards me in a manner that I had not observed from David in an extended period of time. The expression of a man who was not merely gazing at me, but was also longing for my presence. I perceived a sense of tension in my body. There was an evident distinction between my spouse and Michael. He was new, not because he was more attractive or superior. My body was jolted by electricity as his hand touched mine. I refrained from retreating, and that was the instant when I realized. It would not conclude at that point. The following morning, upon my awakening, the room continued to emanate Michael's fragrance. I sat on the bed, gazing into the distance, attempting to comprehend the events that had transpired. I anticipated experiencing feelings of remorse. However, this did not transpire. The sensation I experienced was an irreversible transformation. David and Rachel were already seated in the hotel lobby when I arrived a few minutes later. I was uncertain about how to address my spouse, but our eyes met, and I was taken aback. David did not appear to be distressed. He appeared to be at ease, nearly content. Rachel smiled slightly as if everything had transpired precisely as she had anticipated. And that was the moment I came to the realization that we had crossed the line. The excursion concluded, and we resumed our routines. However, what I did not anticipate was that the situation had shifted from its usual state. I believed that I could disregard that evening. I believed it was merely a small experiment to revitalize the marriage. Subsequently, Michael sent a text message. "Do you recall?" I should have promptly expunged the message. However, I refrained from doing so. When I observed David and Rachel exchanging glimpses across the living room, I was aware that he was also maintaining communication with her. I was unable to halt, and David was unable to do so either. We believed that it was merely a playful exercise intended to enhance our marital relationship. However, what we were not prepared for was that we had unintentionally opened a door that neither of us could close. "Do you recall?" Michael's message was immediately displayed on my phone screen upon my exit from the shower. I gazed at it, and my heart beat more rapidly without my awareness. It would have been prudent for me to disregard it. I should have promptly deleted it. However, I refrained from doing so. Instead, I responded to the message by tapping it and using a straightforward smiley face. Subsequently, my telephone vibrated once more. I am unable to refrain from contemplating it. I inhaled. A peculiar sensation began to arise within me. A sudden surge of enthusiasm, a slight sense of unease, and perhaps most importantly, a newfound addiction. I was under the impression that David would remain unaware. I believed that I could continue with my life as if nothing had occurred after that night. But then, I began to pay closer heed to him. And I also observed that David was undergoing a transformation. He exhibited an increased use of his smile. He increased the frequency of his phone checks. Then they began to leave at unusual hours. When I exited the bedroom to retrieve a glass of water one evening, I observed him seated on the settee, with the light of his phone screen illuminating his countenance. I paused in an attempt to determine the identity of the individual with whom he was communicating via text. "Rachel?" I was taken aback by the sight. David and Rachel were conducting themselves in a manner that was identical to my interactions with Michael. I experienced an abrupt surge of envy. I was aware that I had no justification for feeling furious. However, this did not prevent the irritation from accumulating within me. What is there for me to say? Did I express my anger at my husband's indiscretion with another woman while I was engaging in the same behavior with Michael? I was unable to express myself. I, on the contrary, assumed that I had not observed anything and simply turned away. However, subsequent to that evening, events began to degenerate. Boundaries were obscured. Initially, Michael and I were merely exchanging texts on a few occasions each week. Then it evolved into evening calls. In the midst of a project, hasty messages are sent. Our interactions during team meetings were brief. Rachel and David were no longer concealing their affair. The glimpses they exchanged were evident when we were together. I am aware that they are also seizing every opportunity to see each other, much like Michael and I. Afterward, it evolved beyond mere text messages or enigmatic expressions. After that night, the first time Michael and I kissed was not in a private hotel room, but in his kitchen, as Rachel had just departed to retrieve the children. The first time David and Rachel discreetly met was not in a peculiar coffee shop, but rather in our home while I was out shopping. We began to engage in this perilous activity in our personal lives, in full view of our peers. Additionally, what is the most peculiar? Michael and I once convened at his office. It was an ordinary afternoon. I inadvertently extended an invitation to him to lunch during my visit. However, when the office door was closed and no one was present, the situation spiraled out of control. I was unable to look David in the eye when I arrived home that evening. However, he avoided inquiring about my destination as he was also spending an illicit evening with Rachel. Our marriage had been transformed into a perilous game, one that was jointly enjoyed by all four of us. However, the issue was that there were no regulations. Initially, I believed that everything would be under control and that we would be able to determine when to cease. However, we were unable to abandon the novel sensation once it had established itself. I was unable to recall the last time I lay next to David without contemplating Michael. I was unable to recall the last time I saw Rachel without experiencing a tinge of envy. David and I were still legally married. However, in actuality, we had completely lost touch. The subject of employment and life was no longer discussed. We ceased to inquire about each other's days. Rather, I merely beamed faintly when David arrived home late. Additionally, when I discreetly departed for the weekend, he neglected to inquire about my destination. We had lost interest in one another. What were we anticipating? In order for the game to disintegrate? In order for an individual to commit an error? Is it possible for one of us to lose everything? I believed that the situation could persist indefinitely, that neither of us would be required to endure the repercussions as long as we exercised caution. But then one day I entered the house and observed David sitting on the sofa, his expression as icy as ever. My phone was situated directly in front of him. The most recent text from Michael was still visible on the screen. I am missing you. Will we meet again in the future? My esophagus was parched. There was literally no turning back. There was a complete breakdown of all systems. The inquiry was, who would endure greatest hardship? David fixed his gaze on me. Not in a furious manner. I am not shrieking. Not incriminating. He simply sat there, his eyes cold and eerily silent, as if he had known all along and was waiting for the moment I would disclose myself. I attempted to devise an explanation by swallowing. However, what else could I possibly convey? Michael's message was immediately apparent. The display. Without a doubt. Erasing is not feasible. Could you elaborate? David's voice was composed and subdued. I opened my mouth, but no sound emanated. I intended to convey that it was a jest, an error. However, I was aware. We had exceeded our limits. David retrieved his telephone. The messages were examined by his eyes. He then grinned. A sarcastic, bitter grimace. Therefore, you are not the sole individual who harbors secrets. His words were akin to a smack in the face. What do you mean? I inquired, although I was aware of the answer in my heart. David gazed at me for an extended period of time. Then he placed his phone on the table and retrieved an additional item. A collection of photographs that were printed from his mobile device. I gazed downward. Rachel was the individual in question. Additionally, David. Hugs. The gaze. The meetings that are conducted in secrecy. Each occasion was meticulously recorded, as if it were irrefutable evidence that we had betrayed each other in the same manner. I experienced the sensation of the earth collapsing beneath me. For how long have you been aware? I inquired, my voice quivering. David shook his head. For an extended period of time. However, I assume you did as well, correct? Neither of us expressed it. However, we were both aware. The relationship was long since deceased. I slept in the bed that David and I had shared that evening. For 12 years. However, the distance between us had never been so great. Neither of us discussed the events that had transpired. However, the silence that separated us was sufficient to convey the message. David departed the residence earlier than he typically did the following morning. I declined to inquire about his destination. I did not await a text message from Michael. I experienced a sensation of my universe collapsing for the first time in months. Rachel was the first to shatter the silence. She reached out to me a week later, her voice still trembling. Michael is aware. I was paralyzed. What is the matter? He discovered the information. Hannah, he is aware of everything. Additionally, he is unwilling to extend forgiveness. My larynx contracted. I was unable to assign responsibility to Michael. He could not be pardoned for this. Rachel. I began to speak, but she interrupted me. David informed him. My heart ceased to beat. Did David inform Michael? Therefore, that implied. He resolved to terminate the entire situation. I remained in the living room that evening, anticipating my fate. I was unaware of the reason for my anticipation. Subsequently, the door was opened and David entered. He gazed at me. His eyes were no longer filled with anger or reproach. Blank. I believe that we are both aware of the forthcoming events. He stated with a gentle yet firm tone. I refrained from objecting. I refrained from weeping. I simply nodded. I knew that we were finished. David filed for divorce the following day. Rachel forsake Michael. For individuals who were once two happy spouses are now strangers with wounds that will never heal. I had believed that it was all a mere pastime. A small experiment to revitalize our marriage. However, there was one detail that I had overlooked. Playing with fire results in burns. We lost everything as a result of our inquiry and our fleeting emotions. And when everything collapsed, none of us could return to the previous state. There was no one else to blame but myself. However, I am certain of one thing. I would never cross that line if I could go back in time. I believe that I would experience a sense of liberation following the event. This is the case. There will be no more silent, weighty nights with David. I will no longer conceal my phone. I no longer experience anxiety whenever I receive a text message from Michael. There will no longer be any remorse that infiltrates my every breath. However, the actuality was vastly different from my expectations. Freedom that I desired. Not only did it not bring pleasure, but it also left an empty void that could not be filled. David's departure resulted in an overwhelming sense of spaciousness and solitude within the residence. The items that had belonged to him were still present. His outerwear was still affixed to the door. His preferred cup of coffee continued to remain on the table. However, they were all remnants of a marriage that had ended in divorce. Michael vanished from my existence as well. He refrained from sending a text message. He did not make a phone call. He selected Rachel. I had anticipated that he would at least attempt to contact me. That we had collectively violated all boundaries. That was at least meaningful. However, it transpired that I was merely an error in his life. The same way that he was an error in my own. I contemplated whether Rachel harbored any remorse. I was curious as to whether David ever contemplated the events that transpired. However, I soon came to the realization that it was of no consequence. I commenced my attendance. The time it takes to return home from work is becoming increasingly delayed. I am endeavoring to immerse myself in my work in order to forget about everything. I avoided locations where I could potentially encounter David or Michael. I was hesitant to access outdated communications. Refused to examine photographs from the joyful times. I once believed that I could manage every aspect of life. That this was merely a minor endeavor. An experience designed to revitalize the marriage. However, I neglected to include one item. Certain items should not be subjected to testing. I lost the man who cherished me more than anything. For the sake of a fleeting emotion. I became lost solely due to my insatiable curiosity. The most distressing aspect is that I am unable to return. I am now left with unanswered queries. Could David and I have salvaged our marriage if I had not consented to that absurd notion? Would the outcome have been different if I had ceased my activities earlier? Would I be content with my spouse at this moment if I had never crossed that line? However, the cost of regret is that it is impossible to reverse the passage of time. Remember, there are challenges that should not be attempted if you are bored in your marriage or are seeking something new to change. There are boundaries that should not be breached. We initially believed that it was merely a game. However, upon its conclusion, we came to the realization that there were no victors, only broken souls and ruined marriages. Do you believe it is feasible to evaluate a marriage without incurring repercussions? Or do you believe that you will eventually be burned if you toy with fire? Please share your thoughts in the comments section. The story's just beginning. There are more broken hearts and dark secrets ahead. Hit like, subscribe, and keep exploring with Love Missteps.